to this third lesson on positive parenting. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about what to do if you have a child that is uncooperative in using the positive parenting tool.
Right. So what if, and this is something that several of my clients have asked me is, well, I've tried the positive parenting, and my child just won't do it. Well, number one, your child's not doing it anyways. You're doing it. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is there will be times where a child will resist the positive parenting. So they won't.
So they don't want to come aside with you, even though you're offering them a reward. They don't want to tell about what happened. They don't want to listen to your perspective.
They don't care about. They appear not to care about the compliment, and they won't come up with a solution. And if you come up with a solution for them, right? So you say, okay, you didn't come up with a solution. Here's a couple of options, and that's when using like a love and logic is really appropriate. Is at the end of the positive parenting, if a child doesn't come up with a solution or comes up with a solution that's just totally inappropriate, that you can give them two options. Say, hey, try this or this.
Okay, so let's say they reject the options.
They reject the options.
You give them, say, okay, we're going to do this, and then they refuse to carry it out.
Right.
All right, so they're completely uncooperative.
Correct. So
what do you do?
This is what we're going to have. This is what you do. Okay. You go backwards. That's it. You go backwards. So so here's the thing. You've gone through the positive parenting. You've given them a couple of options. They've rejected all of your options. What do you do now? Well, what's the next step? You're going to go backwards in those levels of motivation. So, okay, the next thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to compliment my child. When they've now refused to
and you are
participate.
probably feeling more and more agitated because you've been spending this time frustrated all this time with your uncooperative child.
Right.
You probably do not feel very complimentary.
No, but you're going to compliment them anyways. You're going to pay them a compliment, and then you're going to tell them your perspective. Your perspective of, hey, I've been trying to work with you for the last several minutes. I've offered you a reward. I've asked you to talk to me about what happened. I told you what my perspective was. I complimented you and offered to let you come up with a solution. And when you couldn't come up with a solution, I offered you a couple of solutions. You rejected those solutions. And now this is what I've seen. What's going on? Right? Now I'm going back.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me what's going on. And if they still don't want, here's the thing. If they tell you what's going on, then you go right back, straight back up. Don't go all the way backwards.
So you don't continue going backwards.
Don't continue going backwards. If they open up and they start telling you what's going on, then you move back.
Then you
listen.
Then you give your perspective. You compliment them again and come up with a solution.
Exactly.
And progress.
And progress. So what you're going to do when they're uncooperative, go backwards. But if at any point that they start to engage, then you move forward again.
Okay.
But if they still don't engage and they're still uncooperative, they still won't tell you what their perspective is and what's going on, then you go back to a reward. Yeah, I know it sounds hard. Then you do the reward again, or you offer another reward that might fit more with, maybe they were not in the mood for that reward. Okay, we'll do something else. And after that, then you go finally back to the fear of consequence, and you come up with a consequence that has to be a more forceful consequence.
So since and we really do need to understand the levels of motivation to do this. So if you are at this point in this class and you really haven't watched the lessons on the levels of motivation, we highly recommend that you watch that.
Go back and watch that, and then come back to this class.
Because the levels of motivation are super important to understand here.
Mm-hmm.
Is that when you're moving forward in the positive parenting tool, you're moving upward in levels of motivation.
Right.
And the positive parenting tool started at
fear of consequences.
At
because
level
that's
0.
level 0.
Okay, but the first step of it.
Right. The first thing that
brought
you're
you
doing
into
as
reward.
a parent. Mm-hmm.
And so when you're going backwards, you might get all the way back to a consequence, and you might say at this point none of these higher levels are motivated the child, and so
now we have to go back to the fear of consequence as the motivator. And think about this. God does this all the time. Can you think of an example where God did this, where he gave people opportunities, tried to move them up?
I feel like the whole story of the children of Israel in the Exodus is all this particular story. And I don't know. I guess I'm thinking specifically of the story with the quail, where the children of Israel have been in the wilderness. They've been being led by God in a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. They're being fed manna, so they're fed and guarded and protected and led, and they're all complaining about how much better it was in Egypt, where they had meat and fruit and vegetables.
Right. So let's take this story through these levels. So the reward that they're getting right near the beginning is this manna that's coming from heaven. Right. There's no food. They're out in the wilderness. There's no food. So God is blessing them with this reward, which is just this food that falls from the sky. All
they have to do is pick it up off the ground in the morning. It's like dew.
Right. So they pick it up and they have food. Right. So there's a reward. Love and respect. God is there with them. Right. He's constantly there in a cloud, in a whatever. He's always there for them. He doesn't abandon them. And then he gives them the option to come up with some solutions, right? And they're actually really bad at it.
Yeah.
They're, like you say, they complain. No, that's stupid. This is,
And they're rejecting the rewards.
And they reject the reward. So then you go back, right? He's there with them. He doesn't leave them. The love and respect is there.
But he goes and offers another reward. That's why I was thinking it reminded me of, because you talked about, you go back and say, well, the first reward didn't work. Maybe I'll try a different one. And he says, well, they're complaining, so I'll send quail.
Right.
And he sends a huge flock of quail. The scripture says so much quail that it will run out their nostrils.
Well, only because they eat too much.
Yes, yeah.
Because
so the flock of quail is like covering the whole ground, deep on the ground, and they basically just have to go scoop up quail and have all the meat they want.
So he does. He sends them this other reward, but he also has to give them a consequence, because that reward wasn't enough. They continue to complain.
Then they kind of get illness from the quail, from the overconsumption of the quail. And and it becomes, it was a reward, but it becomes a plague. That's why I was thinking reward, then going down to consequence.
It becomes a consequence because of the way they misuse the reward. But God knew, because he told them in advance, if I send you this other reward, it's going to be a consequence, because like you said, he tells them it'll be running out of your nose and your mouth, and because he knew what would happen. He knew that this would be a consequence, but he did. He went up the levels of motivation. When they were uncooperative and resistant, then he had to go back, and went all the way back to consequences.
Do you think that doing this reverse engineering process, by the time you get to consequence, instead of just going up, having an uncooperative child, and jumping immediately back to the consequence, helps you as a parent feel more in control and give a more reasonable, rational consequence?
Absolutely.
So that if you get to the point where you're at the end of this process, you've been trying to go through all the positive parenting steps, the child's been totally uncooperative. If you just jump right to consequence at that point, you're likely to give an overly harsh consequence.
You're likely to give an overly harsh consequence, and regardless of the type of consequence you give, you're likely to give a consequence out of anger. Yeah. And if you go backwards, then when you get to the consequence, it's going to be a consequence out of love.
It gives you a chance to get back in control and get your motivations in line.
Yep. It brings you back to this sense of, okay, I have to do this. I don't want to do this, but I have to do this. And your child will see that. They will see that, and they will recognize it.
So it is important that the misbehavior has a consequence at some point.
Always.
And whether you're able to bring the child to coming up with and carrying out the consequence or not, you don't end
Without a consequence. No.
What if a child is uncooperative through not all of the stages? Like they start, they're willing to come and get the reward. They're willing to tell you their part, but then they become uncooperative. They won't listen to your perspective and come up.
Right, then
Do you start reversing at the point they start being uncooperative?
No.
Or do you go all the way through?
You go all the way through, and if they're uncooperative in the end, then you start going back.
So let's say they were uncooperative in the beginning, but then they become more cooperative as it goes on. Then you don't worry about the fact that they were uncooperative in the beginning.
No, not at all.
The only point that it's important is that they're cooperative in the end.
The only part that's important is they're cooperative at the point of the consequence.
Yes, that's what.
If they're willing to give themselves a consequence and carry it out,
even if they seemed uncooperative the whole way around.
Absolutely. Then it's worked. It was successful, and if they're not cooperative at that point, and you have to go all the way back to a consequence where you're giving a consequence, it's still worked. The tool has still worked. That's the thing is, it's not about your child. That's the thing you have to really understand. It's not about your child. This is a parenting tool. It's not a changing your child to be somebody else's tool. It's about you as a parent being able to manage and control your lower levels of consciousness while you are trying to help your child understand there are consequences that have to come from your actions.
Okay, so I'm just picturing this visually as moving through steps, right? So we move, and either end of the steps are consequences.
Right.
And so you say you move here, you get a consequence, you're done. It doesn't matter what got you there. You got here, you didn't get a consequence, you go down towards this consequence. At any point, they start seeming like they're
cooperative.
Then you move towards this consequence.
Then you move back towards this consequence.
And you only come to this consequence if there's no point at which you can get them back up to here. Okay.
Correct.
Let's say you moved here, child's uncooperative. You go down, they're starting to be cooperative. You move up, and they still don't come up with a consequence. Do you go all the way back down again?
Absolutely.
Through each step in a row.
Through each step in a row. Now the steps will get shorter. If you're going like woo 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 back and forth, these steps are going to get shorter. And eventually it's going to get to a point where you realize a child sometimes will try to be manipulative, and if they know the steps because you've gone through it multiple times and they think, "Oh, I'm just going to be cooperative at this point. I'm going to not cooperate
because they want to keep you in
limbo."
Here,
if they want to try to keep you in limbo, and you'll recognize that, and that's not cooperative. So if they start,
even if they seem like they're cooperating, if you can tell they're doing it just to keep the process going.
If you go up and back and up and back, by the time you get back here, they've already been uncooperative, and you just keep going to the end. Okay. So it's not like you're going to do this 10 times in a row. Probably the most.
No ad infinitum. To
right. Probably the most you want to do it is 3 times. The third time.
So 3 times meaning 1, 2, 3. Which is the third one?
Yes, the third. So 3 times would be asking them what's going on. When you're at that step number 2, right? Mm-hmm. You should never hit that step more than 3 times. So you're going 1, 2. If they then are like, okay, I'll tell you what's going on. Then you go back up this way, and if they still won't come up with a consequence, you come back. 3, if they are cooperative again, then you come back up. But the next time you come back, it doesn't matter if they're going to tell you or not. You're going all the way to the end because they've had 3 chances to tell you what's going on.
Okay, so 3 chances to give them the explanation
for their explanation. Okay. And once they've given that explanation 3 times, you're not giving them a 4th time. 3 strikes and you're out. I mean, it's not, but it is. It is kind of this idea that, you can't go on bouncing back and forth with a child forever. There's a manipulative element to that where the child feels like I'm getting what I want by forcing my parent to stay in this middle ground, and I never get to a consequence.
Do you recommend parents have sort of generic consequences that they routinely use, so that let's say you get to this point, you've got your uncooperative child, you're going back, you're having to implement the consequence. Is it good to have set consequences like, well, when you don't come up with your own consequence, what we do is we lose screen time for an hour, or whatever your sort of thing is.
I wouldn't say it that way, but yes. So for example, God does this. He tells us way beforehand what the consequence is going to be. But he doesn't always make us have that consequence just because we did what was wrong. He takes us through these levels. We have an opportunity oftentimes to come up with our own consequence, to deal with our situation, and we're forgiven and we move on. But if we don't do that, then it goes back and we get the consequence that God told us would be the consequence. That's the thing. And so yes, for most things, you should have a set rule that you say, this is what happens in our home if you hit somebody. This is the consequence. Now, when somebody hits somebody and you start doing the positive parenting, they might get to this point and say, well, I guess this has to happen because that's our family rule. Wonderful. If they're going to carry it out, that's fantastic. If they come up with a different consequence, that's just as good. Wonderful. Let them do that.
So it's okay if you say this is the consequence for the family rule, but then you allow them to choose a different consequence.
So long as it's one that fits the situation and is appropriate, yes. But if you go back to the consequence, it can't just be anything you want to do. It has to be the consequence that you set. So if you're the one giving the consequence, it has to be the consequence you set in advance. If they're the ones coming up with the consequence, it can be anything so long as it is appropriate and fits the situation.
Yeah, so having preset consequences also helps you with the control part, where you're not just lashing out at the child out of anger.
Right. So I worked with a client recently, and their consequence for disrespecting their parents is to get a spanking. And they were asking me, they're like, I don't know if this is appropriate, is spanking okay? And I said, well, if that's your consequence, spanking is not necessarily a bad consequence. I'm not sure that I would have a spanking for that particular issue, but
we
spanking
tend
is
to
not
be
my
anti-spanking.
Spanking is not my personal. It's not a consequence I personally like. I will say I don't think it's. Some people will say it's abusive. I don't agree with that. I don't think it's abusive. I think spanking is a legitimate consequence for some things, and for some families. But
you also think it's not usually a super effective consequence.
No, it's not. But here's the thing. Also, if you're going to spank, it cannot be out of anger. If you're spanking a child out of anger, that is wrong. So that's why you want to use this. If you say spanking is what happens with this family, spanking is what happens if you're disrespectful, okay? And then one of their children's disrespectful, then they take them through these levels of these steps of positive parenting. When they get to that fifth step, that child has the option to develop their own consequence. That's not getting spanked. And if it's an appropriate consequence, you have to let them do it. But if they're resistant the whole way up and you end up coming all the way back and you've told them in advance spanking is what happens, then that's what has to happen. And it should be out of sadness, out of I don't want to have to do this. I tried, I brought you all the way up and tried to give you an opportunity to do something else. I think about the city of Nineveh and Jonah. Right? Jonah, the Lord says to Jonah, go tell the city of Nineveh that if they don't repent, they're going to be destroyed. Right? They were doing wicked things. But he didn't say just you're going to be destroyed. He said if you don't repent, you're going to be destroyed. So in other words, he said, I'm going to take you through these levels. You get to here, and if you come up with a good consequence that helps you to stop this behavior, then you're going to be okay. If not, then we're going to go back down here, and I'm going to have to destroy you.
And Jonah was frustrated that Nineveh didn't get destroyed.
Yeah, Jonah doesn't like positive parenting. He was upset because he wanted Nineveh to get destroyed. He didn't want to give them this opportunity to come up with their own consequence and change their own behavior. He wanted their behavior to be changed through the destruction.
Okay, I want to go back to your spanking, disrespecting story, because I feel like, as an example, there's a problem with that specific example.
Okay.
And it is that disrespecting parents is very vague. And it seems to me like if you're going to have a specific rule, consequence for a specific action, it can't be something that the parents can just then identify. That was disrespectful, and children are not going to to know.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's really important.
And then after we talk about that, then I just want to talk about spanking one a little bit
more. I think I agree. I think it's really one of the things that is really important is if you're going to give your child a consequence, you've got to be clear about what the rule is, and it has to be clear. And saying,
and I think parents feel like saying don't be disrespectful to the parents feels clear.
Right, but you have to define what disrespect is, and you can only give them the consequence within that definition. So if you say disrespecting your parent is calling your parents names,
swearing at your parents, slamming and throwing things.
Slamming and throwing. That's not disrespecting your parents so much. It could be.
If your parent, if the parent says, okay,
direct disobedience.
Direct. Okay.
If I say I want you, I need you to do this, and you say no. Okay. Direct disobedience.
So whether you call it disrespect or not, you could say, when I tell you to do something, it is inappropriate to respond by slamming or throwing things.
Correct.
Whether you label it disrespect or not.
So you might say, if I ask you to do something and you slam and throw things, that's disrespect. But you can't just say slamming and throwing things is disrespect to your parents because maybe they're slamming and throwing things. But this is the point. This is why it's important that we're talking about this.
Because it seemed clear from my perspective, but you're saying that was vague.
Yeah, that would have been very vague to a child. And that's so here's the thing. You have to have consequences, predetermined consequences, and the rules have to be clear. Anything that's outside of the rule, you still can use the positive parenting for, but when you come back to the consequences at the end where you're having to give a consequence, then it can't be any of the consequences that are specific to the specific rules.
And it has to be you can give consequences for specific actions, but not for feelings. And disrespect is really like, I felt disrespected. Mm-hmm. If disrespecting the parents to you means I felt disrespected by what you did, you can't punish a child for how you feel, and they can't know for sure what behaviors are going to make you feel that way unless you've delineated precisely what behaviors are going to come from that. And if they do something and you say, well, that was disrespectful, and they say, I didn't know, then don't you think at that point you have to delineate the rules before you can start implementing consequences?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, with the positive parenting, and this is a good point. If you're doing a positive parenting with a behavior that the child did not know was a rule, then when you get to the consequences, you ask them what needs to happen now. And if they don't come up with a consequence, and you end up having to go all the way back to consequences, then what your consequence has to be is, okay, well, the next time that this behavior happens, this is what will happen. Then you set a consequence.
Yeah.
You can't give a consequence. You can set a consequence for the future, but you can't give a consequence this time.
Unless there's been a clearly defined behavior and attached consequence.
Right. They can give themselves a consequence going forward and say, oh yeah, I can see how this was wrong, what I did, and okay, I need to probably do this. Wonderful, wonderful. But if you end up having to go backwards and you get all the way back to consequences, what you can do is say, I understand that you didn't know that this was an inappropriate behavior, that this was against the rules in our home. So now we know this is a rule, and in the future, if this happens again, this will be the consequence, right? But then that's it. You have to be done. You can't give them that consequence right then. You have to wait until the next time they have that behavior. And if you find out, hey, this is a rule that wasn't clear, then and other children might fall into that, then you probably ought to have a family council about it at some point and say, hey, everybody, we want you all to know this is a new rule for our home, and this is the consequence that is attached to it. But you can't give a consequence for something that they had not been warned about in advance. And think about God. God doesn't just, give consequences. He always gives us a warning in advance. Now, what's wonderful about God is not only does he tells us what the consequence will be for the misbehavior, but he almost always gives us a warning too before he gives that consequence. And this is something else that's important. When you come back to the consequence, even if there's a set rule and a set consequence, you as the parent have the right to say, remind the child, this is the consequence for this behavior. Today, we're not going to do this. But if this behavior happens again, I will have no choice but to
And that's not being too permissive.
That's not being too permissive. You've done the positive parenting. You've talked through the situation. You've taught the child. You've come back. You've said, okay,
And you just have to do that based on the spirit and your personal reading of the situation what's going to be required.
Yes, you do, but you also have to be careful not to do it too many times in a row. You can't say, be like, okay, next time though, and then the next time you're like, well, next time. No, you can do it once, and then the next time there has to be a consequence, and then you might be able to do it again. But you cannot.
But the child should feel like you are bound by the rules the same way that they're bound by the rules.
And that you can give a degree of mercy, but mercy cannot rob justice.
And a degree of mercy does not mean permissiveness.
Right.
Which is very dangerous to your children.
Absolutely.
Okay. Before we finalize, I just want to come back to spanking one time, because I feel like when you said that spanking is not necessarily abusive, I just want to clarify that the distinction between whether spanking is abusive or not is not only whether it's done in anger or in love.
Right.
Because somebody can feel like they're acting in love and be physically abusing their child. And so I just want to be really careful to say that if you do choose to use corporal punishment, you need to be super cautious with it, because it is very easy for it to be abusive. I'll agree with you that it's not inherently abusive.
I will say,
but it tipped the line there is very fine, and you have to be super careful. The thing that you have to
understand is this too. If you are actually harming your child,
injuring them in any way,
that is not okay. And I don't not abuse. I'm not even going to get into that. If you are harming your child, you are wrong, and you are sinning against God and against your child. If you are spanking a child in such a way that it is harming them, you are wrong. Don't do it. Spanking as a parenting tool, and again, I'll tell you right now, I don't like it. I never use it. I don't know that I've ever spanked any of my children. It's just not something I would do. And the only reason I'm saying that I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing is because I have seen parents who have used it, and it's not, and I don't think they've been abusive and hurtful and harmful to their children. But Jessica is right. If you are going to use that as a form of punishment, there are two things that you have to know. Number one, if you ever strike your child out of anger, you're wrong, you're sinning against God, and you're sinning against his little ones. And that is, he's already made it very clear that to sin against children is the worst thing that you can do. I mean, he says if you sin against a child, it would be better for you to have a millstone hung around your neck and drown. And then secondly, if you harm a child in any way in your discipline, that also, so out of anger or in any way harm a child, you're wrong. And that's partly why I don't like spanking, because sometimes I don't know how much damage I'm actually doing. It's hard to make that judgment and know. And so my recommendation, I'm going to give you my recommendation. My recommendation is don't use spanking as a consequence when your children misbehave. That's my personal and my professional recommendation.
But we're not condemning you. We're just saying if you do choose that as your discipline, be very, very cautious, and just recognize that it's very easy to use it inappropriately. Okay. So on that somber note that I just wanted to be really clear about.
Here's my assignment for you this week. And you would think my assignment would be use this tool in reverse, but it's not. My assignment for you this week is to identify your household rules, the ones that are really important to you. And
there shouldn't be 100 of them.
No, you should really have about 5 or 6 rules. That
maybe 10.
Maybe up to 10 that are really important. Identify those ones. If you have more than 10, you need to start eliminating some. Find out which ones are less important. And then you need to identify an appropriate consequence to be attached to each of them, so that when you do use this tool in reverse, you are prepared.
And I just want to say to that, your rules need to have specific, concrete, enforceable positions. So if your rule is, in our house, we speak respectfully to each other, then you need to delineate. That means we don't swear at each other, we don't name call, we don't shout at each other.
Right. You need to clarify so that children know exactly what they can and can't do.
And other adults. This isn't specific to children as far as like clear expectations. We often assume that other adults understand clearly what we're saying, and that is rarely true. Right.
Absolutely. So that's our assignment for you. Anywhere from 5 to 10 household rules, no more than 10, no less than 5, and a clearly delineated rules with an appropriate consequence attached.
All right, we'll see you back for the last lesson.